Welcome to the BWISE PoliSports Podcast, where sports is never just sport. I'm your host, Political Leo, and this is Queens of the Court, where we break down power, politics, economics, and the influence in women's sports with a focus on voices, the impact, and the evolution of Black women at the center of it all. Today's episode is the foundation, because before we get into our 6-part mini-series, From Brand to Power, we need to establish the framework. We need to understand what we're actually looking at when we watch today's athletes move through the world. This is the theory of power in modern women's sports. In the NIL era, something fundamentally has shifted. Black women athletes are no longer just players. They are no longer just talent within a system. They are becoming systems themselves. We are witnessing a transformation from brand to platform to ecosystem. And that evolution, it is changing who holds power in sports. Not organizations, not leagues, not media alone, but individuals. And more specifically, individuals who understand how to convert attention into influence and influence into infrastructure. This is where the game changes. Because a brand gets recognition, a platform commands attention, but an ecosystem moves market, an ecosystem shapes narrative, an ecosystem forces institutions to respond. And in today's landscape, we are watching a new kind of athlete emerge, what I call a gravity star. A player so powerful that everything begins to orbit around them. The media, the fans, the controversy, the revenue, even the direction of the league itself. Now let's be clear. This didn't happen overnight. This is a result of cultural shifts, digital media expansion, NIL policy changes, and a generation of athletes who understand that visibility is currency. And currency, when used correctly, becomes power. So before we break down this evolution step by step in our upcoming series, we're going to introduce the model. We're going to define each phase. And then we're going to briefly examine one of the most visible case studies in modern sports today, Angel Reese. Not to tell her full story, that's coming in episode 1, but to show you in real time what it looks like when an athlete begins to transition from player to a brand to a platform and ultimately to something much bigger. Because once you understand this framework, you won't just watch the game differently, you'll understand the power behind it. Let's get into it. Phase 1. That's where it all begins. This is the recognition era. This is where people know you. Now let's ground this in what we're actually seeing in today's NIL era, because this part is happening faster than ever before. A Black female athlete steps onto the national stage. Maybe it's March. Maybe it's the Final Four. Maybe it's a national championship game where the lights are the brightest and the stakes are the highest. Or maybe it's even not the championship. Maybe she's the leading scorer in the country. Maybe she's Defensive Player of the Year. Maybe she's breaking records in track and field, dominating heat, setting times that force people to pay attention. But at some point, there's a moment where performance meets visibility. And when that happens, recognition explodes. Now here's what builds that brand in this phase. First, elite performance. Because no matter how much we talk about media, narratives, or visibility, performance is still the entry point. You have to produce. You have to dominate. You have to do something that makes it impossible to ignore you. But performance alone isn't enough anymore. Not in the NIL era, because the second piece is identity, presence, confidence, style, energy, the unapologetic way an athlete carries themselves on and off the court, on the track, in interviews, on social media. This is where we see something different with this generation. They are not shrinking themselves to fit into comfort. They are expanding and forcing the world to adjust. And then comes the third piece, the moment, the viral moment. It might be a gesture, a celebration, a stare, a post-game quote, something that hits culture, not just sports. And when that moment lands, the reaction is immediate. Some people love it. Some people criticize it. Some people debate it. But everybody sees it. And that's the point. Because in phase one, brand is built through recognition. And recognition doesn't require agreement. It requires attention. Now, what does that look like? It looks like high visibility. It looks like your name is trending. It looks like people forming strong opinions about you, positive and negative. It looks like an identity-driven following, where supporters aren't just fans of your game. They are fans of what you represent. And for black women in sports, this carries a different weight, because recognition often comes with projection, label, narrative, misinterpretation. Confidence gets called arrogant. Emotion gets called aggression. Dominance gets questioned instead of celebrated. So even in this early phase, there's tension. But here's the part most people miss. Despite all that visibility, despite all that attention, despite all that conversation, power is still limited here. Because in phase one, attention is reactive. The audience is responding to moment. The media is reacting to moment. The conversation is being driven by what just happened, not by what the athlete is strategically building. She is visible. She is known. She is talked about. But she is not yet in full control of the narrative. And that distinction is everywhere. Because a brand gets recognition, but recognition alone does not equal power. It's the beginning, not the destination. And every athlete who becomes a true force in this space starts right here. And this is where the shift begins. Because once recognition is established, the question is no longer, do people know you? The question becomes, do they listen to you? That transition is what moves an athlete into phase two. Phase two is the platform era. This is the control era, where influence starts to take shape and voice becomes a form of power. This typically happens in the late college to early professional transition, where athlete is no longer just having moments, she's building continuity. You're seeing her regularly, interviews, press conferences, social media, brand campaigns, podcast appearances. She's no longer popping in and out of conversation. She's in it consistently. Now, what changes here is not just visibility, but intention. In phase one, the world reacts to her. In phase two, she begins to respond with purpose. Her voice sharpens. Her messaging becomes clearer. She starts to define who she is publicly instead of allowing others to define it for her. And this is where NIL becomes a real tool, not just a paycheck. Because now the deals start to reflect identity, not just performance, but personality, values, and alignment. Who she partners with begins to tell a story about who she is. And the audience starts to recognize that. They're not just watching her play anymore. They're listening to what she says, how she moves, what she stands on. And this is where one of the most important shifts happen. She gains the ability to trigger conversation. She's no longer just part of the headline. She can become the headline. When she speaks, it generates response. When she posts, it creates discussion. When she shows up, the energy shifts. And that's because the audience now expects her voice. They're not waiting to see what happens to her. They're waiting to hear from her. This is also where the narrative control starts to form. She can defend herself. She can clarify situations. She can redirect the story, and while she may not have full control yet, she has influence over how she is perceived. And the media begins to adjust, because instead of just covering her performances, they start following her presence. Her interviews get clipped, her statements get debated. Her perspective becomes part of the storyline, not just her stat. So the center of gravity starts to shift. And this is a key transition. She moves from being talked about to being listened to. And that shift, that's where real power starts to form. And this is where everything comes together. Because once an athlete has recognition, and once she develops a voice that people actually listen to, the next question becomes, what is being built around her? To understand phase 3, we have to define something clearly: an ecosystem. In sports, an ecosystem is not just about the player, it's about everything that begins to organize itself around that player. The people, the media, the business interests, the conversation, the energy. It's a living network. And as an athlete moves from brand to platform, what she's really doing is laying the foundation for that network to form. In phase 1, she captures attention. In phase 2, she directs attention. But in phase 3, she becomes the center of attention. And that's where we enter the power era. Phase 3 is the ecosystem. This is where people don't just watch you, they build around you. This is where teammates gain visibility simply by being in proximity to you. Where games featuring you don't just matter, they drive attendance, rating, and ticket demand. Where brands are no longer just interested in your image, they want access to your audience. Because at this level, you are no longer just an athlete with influence, you are infrastructure. The conversations around you begin to expand beyond basketball. Now we're talking culture, identity, fashion, business, social dynamic, media narrative. You are no longer contained within the lines of the game. The game starts to orbit within your larger presence. And this is where the concept evolves even further into what we call an audience ecosystem. At its core, an audience ecosystem is a total network of people, platforms, narratives, and engagement patterns that follow not just a player, but everything connected to them. It's not just fame. It's how attention moves, how it multiplies, and how it converts into value. It's the interview, the clip, the debate, the endorsement, the social media conversation, the cultural moment, all feeding into each other, all expanding reach, all reinforcing presence. And once an athlete reaches this level, power shifts, because now influence is no longer situational, it's structural. Now, does all of this stay theoretical, or can we actually see it happening in real time? Let's bring this framework to life. Let's look at a modern example of what it means to move through these phases and begin forming an ecosystem that extends far beyond the court. Angel Reese, and more specifically, let's break down what her ecosystem actually looked like. Her layers, her reach, her gravity. Let's get into it. Now let's bring the framework to life, because theory only matters if we can see it in motion. When we talk about a gravity star, an athlete who becomes the center of attention, influence, and economic movement, we're talking about someone whose presence creates layers. Layers of connection, layers of visibility, layers of impact. And when we look at Angel Reese, we can clearly see those layers forming into a full ecosystem. At the center of that ecosystem is the core audience. These are loyal, identity-connected supporters. The people who don't just watch her, they align with her. They see themselves in her, confident, her expression, her story, her resilience. This audience is not casual, it's committed. They defend her, they amplify her, they ride with her through every headline, every critique, every moment. This is the foundation. Because without a core audience, nothing else holds. Then expanding outward is the cultural audience. These are people who may not be traditional fans, but they are engaged. They are watching the debates. They are participating in the conversations. They are reacting to the media narratives, the controversies, the commentary. This is where her presence moves beyond sports and into culture. She becomes a topic, a symbol, a point of discussion that lives across platforms, sports media, social media, mainstream outlets. And whether the conversation is supportive or critical, it keeps her at the center of attention. Next is the commercial layer. This is where brands step in, not just because of what she does on the court, but because of who she reaches. Companies are no longer just buying performance. They are buying access to her audience, her visibility, her cultural relevance. Partnerships begin to reflect alignment, style, identity, voice, influence. And this is where attention starts converting into real economic power. And then we have the team impact layer. Because when an athlete reaches ecosystem status, the effect doesn't stop with her. Teammates gain visibility simply by being associated with her. More cameras, more interviews, more attention. The franchise itself benefits. Higher attendance, increased ratings, more national coverage. The entire environment elevates because of one central figure. Now, when all of these layers are operating at the same time, that's when you know you're no longer looking at a brand. You're looking at infrastructure, because she affects who gets coverage. She impacts who gets opportunity. She shifts how markets respond, what games people watch, what stories get told, where attention flows. And that level of influence, that's not accidental. That's constructed. That's power. So when we step back and look at the full picture, the conclusion becomes clear. Angel Reese didn't just build a brand, she built an ecosystem where attention, culture, and commerce all intersect. And once an athlete reaches that level, the game is no longer just being played on the court. It's being shaped around them. And this is where we take it one step further, because if phase 3 is the ecosystem, then what comes after that? What happens when the ecosystem becomes fully self-sustaining? This is where we introduce the ideal of the audience ecosystem. At its core, an audience ecosystem is the total network of people, platforms, narratives, and engagement patterns that follow. Not just the player, but everything connected to them. It's not just fans. It's how attention moves, how it multiplies, and how it converts into value. And while not every athlete reaches this level, the blueprint is being built in real time. Because once an athlete can consistently generate attention, direct the attention, and expand that attention across culture, media, and business, the next evolution is ownership of that attention. That's where true power lies. And that's where this conversation is going. So when we look at Angel Reese, what we're really seeing is not just where she is, but where she could be headed. From brand to platform to ecosystem. And potentially to an audience ecosystem that operates beyond any single team, league, or a moment. And that's exactly why this framework matters. Because once you understand it, you can see it happening in real time. You can see who's rising. You can see who's being positioned. And more importantly, you can see who's building power. This has been the foundation. This has been the theory of power in modern women's sport. And this is just the beginning. Because in our next episode, we're going to take everything we discussed today and apply it fully. We're going to break down Angel Reese as our first case study in our mini-series, From Brand to Power, step by step, layer by layer, blueprint by blueprint. This is BWISE PoliSports Podcast, Queen of the Court. and I'm your host, Political Leo. Thanks for joining us, and we'd like to hear from you in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe, and spread the word about our channel as we tackle politics and the business of Black women in sports. I'll see you in the next episode.